Welcome to the Royal Society Centre for History of Science. Our lecturer today is Ross MacFarlane, who is Academic Engagement Officer at the Wellcome Library in London. And the title of his talk today is Wellcome's Collectors.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a delight to be here, I have to say. It's an honour and a pleasure. What Felicity didn't mention there is before I am an archivist at the Wellcome Library, I was an archivist here at the Royal Society. So it's a real pleasure to be doing a talk here in this wonderful institution, in this amazing library here. So what am I going to be speaking about today? Well, this is where we're going to be starting things off with this image. This is an image from around about 1914. And it's of the staff of the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. And we don't know too much about this picture. We know that these are staff members. And we know this gentleman here on the left-hand side here. This is a man called T.W. Huck. We know that he was the librarian in the museum. But I think it's a very interesting image to start things off with. And I'm fascinated by this image. It sort of leaps out at me from our collections. I'm fascinated by the conjunction and the possibilities of what this image suggests. The fact that this link between very English, very proper, stiff-collared members of staff, and the fact that they're holding in their hands quite strange, quite exotic artifacts and objects. So we've got some skulls on the left-hand side here, some masks on the right. And immediately from this image, you get a sense. So you immediately get this sense from the collection here that we have something that's very different to what we can imagine as the history of medicine. This is already we're sort of dealing with Wellcome's ideas of medicine not just being a Western progression of key doctors and physicians. So really what I'm going to try and do today is almost hint at how history of medicine can be far more broad than what we might immediately think that discipline to be. And as well as challenging conceptions of the history of medicine and the history of science, the image offers us a way into thinking about the Historical Medical Museum, and that being the story of the staff members employed by Henry Wellcome. So what I want to do today is uncover some of the staff members' stories. Indeed, think not directly of Wellcome's collection, but of Wellcome's collectors. And it's hugely important to understand the development of the collection through the eyes of those who worked for Henry Wellcome himself. And this can be done by the fact that the papers on the day-to-day administration of the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum still survive, and they're available for consultation in the Wellcome Library. So often when I show this image in talks, this is when, if there's anybody in the audience who is a conservator, they get very nervous and start to feel rather faint. I have to assure you this image was taken many years ago. It's not how we store and look after materials in the Wellcome Library nowadays. But I think what the photographer was trying to suggest from this is the towering piles of material that we have in our collection that can trace the stories of how the objects ended up being collected by Henry Wellcome and his staff. So a couple of pointers for what I want to do today is I've decided to focus on Wellcome's collectors and Wellcome's members of staff who were alive during Henry Wellcome's lifetime, and to narrow that down to a couple of specific individuals. I'll be leaving aside the story of Wellcome's collection post-1936, after Henry Wellcome dies, and that's when the collection starts to be dispersed. So that's a talk in itself. That will be left aside today. It's by no means a complete story what I'll be giving you today, but I'd like to think that after we finish, I'll have broadened out the perception that Wellcome's collection was the work of one man alone. And I'm really also building on the work of a number of very skilled scholars over the last couple of decades who've written about Wellcome and the Wellcome Museum. And those names are Gillen Lawrence, John Simons, and Francis Larson. So to properly make a start, we have to start with the man himself. So this is Sir Henry Solomon Wellcome, 1853 to 1936. And it's really with Henry that's where we sort of start this story. Before understanding his collectors, we have to understand him. And this image captures Wellcome at the height of his powers, very much a captain of industry. This is taken around 1900 or so, and at that time, Wellcome is a very successful businessman. He has co-founded a pharmaceutical company in 1880 with another American, Silas Mainville Burroughs. And by 1900, he's a very wealthy individual, somebody who is now in sole charge of his pharmaceutical concern. And also, he's somebody who, key for the development of his business, has the first commercial scientific laboratories in this country. So he is a pace setter and a groundbreaker with thinking about science with regards to what his laboratories were doing, and the fact they were linked to a commercial business in the early 20th century. And it's by the 1930s that he becomes recognized by the scientific community. That does take a little while. So we think of Wellcome nowadays, particularly after the launch of Wellcome Collection in 2007, when the building in the Euston Road was relaunched as that. We think of Wellcome very much as a collector. He's recognized in the public eye as that. However, he was not publicly recognized as a collector during his lifetime. If you go to his obituary in the Times in 1936, the Times obituary is 8 paragraphs long. And it's only in the 7th paragraph that there's a mention of the collection that he'd put together. And given the size and scale of the collection at the time that he died, it's interesting that it wasn't really a known fact about him that you'd record and stress in the official Times obituary. So as I say, by the time that he dies, he's recognized more as a patron of science by the science community. And amongst the honors he receives in the 1930s is Fellowship of the Royal Society. So there is a direct connection between Wellcome and the institution we're in today. Wellcome receives his election to the Fellowship of the Society under Statute 12 of the Rules of the Society, which provided for the recommendation by the Society's Council for election of persons who either have rendered conspicuous service to the cause of science or are such that their election would be of signal benefit to the society. So it's interesting that somebody who, in the early days of his company, had to fight to have his laboratories recognized, is by the time of his death very much at the heart of the scientific community in this country. So let's move to thinking of Henry as a collector. And later in his life, Wellcome said that the inspiration behind his collection started off in his childhood. And he claims, in evidence he gave to the Royal Commission on Museums in 1929, that as a child growing up in the fields of Minnesota in the United States, that he came across a small Neolithic implement. So he took this object back to his father, and his father explained to him that for the age when it was produced, that object would have been as technologically advanced as the railroads that were starting to crisscross America. So Wellcome claims later in life it was this small implement that set him thinking about how objects can tell stories about the societies that they were made in, and how societies evolve over time, the objects would evolve as well, and how you piece those two things together, you can start to tell a story of the history of mankind through the evolution of objects. What's really tricky about this is we've never found that implement. I'm not 100% if that stone implement ever existed. There's slightly the air of Wellcome embellishing a story when he was giving evidence later in his life, and there's reasons why he would be doing it at that time that I can go into later on. But we know that he was, by the time he came to London in 1880, as I say, when he sets up his business. This is the head office of Burroughs Wellcome & Co. in the late 19th century. This is, his head office was on Snow Hill, which in London is close to where Smithfield Market is, near Farringdon. It's one of the great lost buildings of London. I mean, there's many great lost buildings of London, but this one was demolished during the Second World War by enemy action, and it was a beautiful arts and crafts designed interior. And this was the sort of the showcase building for Wellcome's pharmaceutical concern. First building lit by electric lights in the City of London as well. And on the upper floors of the head office was where Wellcome's office actually was. And in a contemporary report from the 1890s, his office was described as being, quote, furnished as a library, although hunting trophies, works of art from countries visited by the occupant, and a varied selection of general literature give it less the look of a commercial room and more the appearance of a bachelor's den. So even when he's this growing nascent businessman on the London commercial scene, there's starting to get a sense of Henry as a collector as well. So the head office of the business had some of his items of interest in there. So during the 1890s, success from his business affords him the wealth to begin to collect. And his collecting developed into plans to collect along the broad lines of the history of medicine. Now, at the time of his death in 1936, it's been estimated, and it's a conservative estimate, that over 1 million items were part of his collection. If you put that into context, that's 4 times the size of the Louvre in Paris. So a collection that had been built up over hundreds of years, Wellcome had sort of gone far past it in just 40 years of collecting. And while I don't want to downplay the fact that Wellcome was personally involved in this collection, he was a keen collector himself. It wasn't just his staff who were collecting in honour of him. And this is evidence of that. In the early 1900s, he would go on collecting trips abroad into Europe. And in very sort of, probably for their time, very cutting-edge automobiles, such as this one. Sitting in the car, this gentleman here is a chap called Ferrer, who worked for Wellcome as his interpreter when he was in parts of Europe, such as Spain and Portugal. It seems Wellcome might have taken this picture himself. It's quite a welcome thing for him to be outside the picture, him sort of directing operations from behind the camera almost. So he makes numerous collecting tours to Europe in the early 1900s. Many of them were made with his wife, who was the daughter of Dr. Bernardo. And the marriage didn't last too long. They split in 1910, mostly due to the wife's boredom at being sort of dragged around Europe on these massive collecting trips and ramshackle roads in cars such as these. So you get the sense of Wellcome, physically traveling abroad, collecting at a personal level. And it's worth pondering the ideas behind what he was doing with his collection. Wellcome was very much a man of his time. And there had been a growth of collecting in the mid to late 19th century in this country. And there was more amateur collectors out there. Magazines such as Exchange and Mart had begun, where collectors could chat to each other, could offer things for sale. So there were more networks, collectors, more objects coming in from across the British Empire to be collected, to be sold, to be exchanged. And it's interesting as well to consider the importance Wellcome had, as I was saying thereabouts. He's thinking behind, you could trace the evolution of mankind through the evolution of objects. And it's really how you can trace how medical objects change over time. That's the ethos behind his collection. And it's just worth considering that the objects were not being collected for necessarily their aesthetic qualities. They're being collected for what they document, what they show. So the artworks that he collects are not necessarily beautiful works of art being collected by other rich industrialists. The artworks are being collected because they're documenting certain aspects of medicine and science across time. And one last thing to consider with Wellcome as a collector is, at a personal level, is his secrecy. So even though he was traveling abroad in ways like this, most of his collecting has been done at auctions. And when he's bidding at auction, he's bidding under a pseudonym or many different pseudonyms. So there's an intriguing sort of polarity there between somebody who's using publicity very, very cannily in the way to market his drugs, but he's being very secret about how he's acquiring material and putting it together in his collection. So we've got to the stage where Wellcome is in the 1890s, he's in sole charge of the company, he has the wealth to build up his collection, and that's where this man moves into the story. This is a gentleman called C.J.S. Thompson, Charles Thompson, 1862 to 1943. And the growth of the collection during the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s is very, very influenced by this man. He's hugely important in considering the development of Wellcome's collection. Thompson's born in Liverpool. He comes from a journalistic background, but he's also a qualified apothecary. And his book, The Chemist's Compendium of 1896, ran into numerous editions. And he was also the author of a number of historical works, a number of popular historical works, with such titles as The Mystery and Romance of Alchemy and Pharmacy, and Poison Romances and Poison Mysteries. And you often see Thompson's works being republished in nice, cheap editions by Dover Press, so sort of look out for them when you're in bookshops. He also dabbled in fiction. This is the only known work of fiction by C.J.S. Thompson, published under a pseudonym. This is his novel Zoroastro. As somebody who's read Zoroastro, I can see why he just dabbled in fiction. Let's just say it's a lone furrow into the world of fiction. But you can tell from this, I mean, this was a novel based around the life of Paracelsus, the alchemist and scholar and medical healer of the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. And it's intriguing as well to think of a lot of the books that Thompson is writing are about occult themes in medicine and science as well, hidden sort of knowledge being explored through his works. So Thompson first becomes involved in the Wellcome enterprise, in the Wellcome business itself, in the pharmaceutical concern. And how he is involved is through writing copy for small publications Wellcome would give out at pharmaceutical launches, pharmaceutical events, meetings of medical events as well, meetings of the British Medical Association, such as little sort of pamphlets that the business put together for a meeting of the BMA in Wales in the early 19th century, in the early 20th century. A work published by Burroughs Wellcome and Co. called Ancient Cymric Medicine. This is possibly the first time an image of people being burnt in a wicker man has ever been shown in the Royal Society. What these little works were doing were almost contrasting histories of medicine, histories of science, with the modern day products of Burroughs Wellcome and Co. So Thompson would write the historical detail on the past history of medicine. Then you get after that adverts for the products that Burroughs Wellcome were making at that time. So that's really, you know, that's how Thompson is being used by Burroughs Wellcome. He's being used as a journalist with an interest in the history of medicine. But quickly he becomes involved with Wellcome's collecting habits. And in 1903, he's put in charge of assembling artifacts for what would become the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum. And he coordinates the work of various employees and agents, and was himself a collector for Wellcome, both in Britain and Europe, and travelled as far as Constantinople. Now, all this work, all this collecting that Thompson is doing, and his network of collectors as well, is saved for us by these reports. So these reports were done by Thompson very regularly for Wellcome. And the red handwriting, which I won't go into at the moment, but that red handwriting with a large finger sign pointing out, this point is important, that's Wellcome's own handwriting. So Thompson would summarize the work that had been going on that month, what had been acquired, and Wellcome would write back going, this is very good, yes, more of that, or no, less of that. No, we've got that already. No, leave that be, leave that be. So it's quite detailed, the accounts that Thompson gives. And you get a real sense of the variety of material that was coming into Wellcome's possession during that time. You get a mix of items associated with famous individuals. You get a sense of the contacts and dealers Thompson is building up. And just the variety and range of the sorts of artifacts that were becoming part of the Wellcome collection. So, for example, to give you examples of famous people whose artifacts were coming in, things like Dr. Johnson's spectacles were purchased, the cap worn by General Gordon of Khartoum when he was killed, the spear said to kill him is collected as well, Lord Nelson's medicine chest, Napoleon Bonaparte's toothbrush, paintings of Lord Lister, and this one I'm very intrigued by, the knocker from the front door of the house in Herne Hill, where John Ruskin was born, purchased from the people demolishing the house. So you get the sense of people being all across London, all across England, trying to find things of interest to Wellcome. These dealers and these contacts, there's paintings purchased from, quote, the man in Kilburn High Road, So I take it that's a sort of business selling things on the Kilburn High Road, not just somebody walking down Kilburn High Road carrying a painting. April 1910, at Foster's auction house, quote, a large glass case which held the contents of a notorious opium den, discovered and raided in London about 1840 after an exposure by Charles Dickens. And from Stevens's auction house as well in 1907, an old Hausa fighting coat with juju and fetish horns, fitted with medicine to render the wearer invisible. So not just local items, but global items as well. You can see now how almost anything can fit in with Wellcome's conception of what medicine and science was. But also with Thompson, as you really get the sense of the secrecy that Wellcome had when he was bidding at auctions, taken to its logical extent by Thompson. There's a very interesting case of a second-hand book dealer, a book dealer in Austria dealing with somebody in England, a company called Epworth & Co. And so the book dealer sends many volumes from Austria to Epworth & Co. And so much so that when the dealer travels to London, he wants to meet the people who work for Epworth & Co. Travels to the address he was sending these books to, and finds a disused, empty property in Fitzrovia. And it's only when some books are sent back that were discarded by Epworth & Co. in a Burroughs, Wellcome & Co. Paper that the dealer realizes this is something set up by Wellcome. So Epworth & Co. was a fake business set up by Thompson. Epworth was his brother's name. And Epworth & Co. is a sort of pseudonym the Wellcome Museum uses for many years to acquire material. But it's not just curios, which I've almost been describing there, that Thompson helps acquire. He's really key to obtaining some of the real treasures, certainly of the Wellcome Library's collection now. He's involved in the 1898 acquisition of books previously owned by William Morris, and a lot of the personal books obtained in 1911 from a gentleman called Frank Payne, I should say, the former Harverian librarian at the Royal College of Physicians. So that's where we get our copy of first edition of Vesalius from, early edition of Newton's Principia Mathematica. And Thompson's key to the acquiral of these works. And it's Thompson as well who convinces Wellcome to open a museum with some of the objects he's been collecting. Thompson is the curator of this museum when it opens. It opens in Wigmore Street, so the heart of London's medical district. And if you walked into the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum, straight off the sort of established medical streets of Wigmore Street, this is what you would have seen. So it opens in 1913, and the first room you'd have walked into is the Hall of Primitive Medicine, as it was called. On the right-hand side is a reconstruction of a headhunter's hut from New Guinea. And in the smaller image down on the left, on the right-hand side of that, is lots of masks and costumes that would have been used in ceremonies and rituals that came from Africa. It's intriguing that there's not much notation of what this material actually is. It's almost all of a whole pushed into this room. But I think it says something about Wellcome's conceptions of things, almost the evolutionary nature of what he was trying to do, is you'd have to walk through the Hall of Primitive Medicine to get to the rest of the museum. But a very odd sort of first encounter, possibly, from stepping from the streets of Edwardian London into this interior. So this room here was the Hall of Statuary. This was the centerpiece of the Museum of the Historical Medical Museum. There's more room here now to look at the artifacts in the cases, the statues that are there, statues from different belief systems, different classical belief systems there. So it's a very interesting site, the Historical Medical Museum, and Thompson is key to its arrangement and the layout of it. And he's also very involved in building up personal connections with a lot of dealers and collectors as well, particularly an English folklorist called Edward Lovett. And it's really key to sort of think of Thompson as central to the heart of the museum. So these friendly connections he's making with dealers and collectors bring into the museum a lot more objects and artifacts. And it's really that way you can start to think of this collection as a sort of collection of collections, if you will. There's many people's life's works get subsumed into the Wellcome Museum over time. But ultimately, in 1925, Thompson leaves Wellcome's employment slightly under a bad light. The official reason given is in breach of contract by writing a book during work time. But it seems that Wellcome had judged Thompson almost to be too much the face of the museum in certain aspects than he was. So Thompson fades out of the story. He later becomes a curator at the Royal College of Surgeons, the Hunterian Museum there. So somebody involved in the history of medicine up until their death, but somebody who leaves the Wellcome employment in the 1920s. So if we're talking about Thompson as a collector who's mostly based in this country, the next collector I'll talk about is somebody who does his work for Wellcome, farther afield, let's say. This is a gentleman called Pyra Mal, 1874 to 1957, and his original plan was to be a missionary, but he switches to medicine and studies for his medical doctorate in Munich. He is by birth from South Asia, and he actually works as the chief medical officer to the Maharaja of Karpathala during the early 1900s. He then ends up as an army surgeon in the first Japanese army during the Russo-Japanese War, so he's a very well-travelled individual already, and comes to London to complete a licentiate at the Royal College of Physicians. And he's employed by the Wellcome from 1910 to 1926, and for the vast majority of that time, he's travelling abroad collecting for Wellcome. He's travelling between 1911 and 1921, mostly travelling in India and South Asia. And of the 12,000 manuscripts, 12,000 South Asian manuscripts in the Wellcome Library's collections, the majority of these are collected by Pyra Mal during that time. And again, the correspondence that survives of Mal, this gives you this great insight into what it was like collecting in that part of the world during that time. It's a wonderful mix of the exotic and the mundane. And one of the bones of contention that Mal frequently has in his letters is he keeps asking for more money to purchase more materials. He has to telegram back to London, to Thompson and to Wellcome, to ask, I think, for more than £3. If he wants to purchase something more than £3, he's got to ask for more money to do so. So there's always lots of disagreement about this over time. So when Mal was sent out originally by Thompson and Wellcome to go on a collecting trip, they thought it would just take 1 year. And this is what they thought he would do. So he'd start off in London, go through Europe, down Southeast Asia, around the coast there, back up into India here, and then back through Europe up to the UK. Doesn't quite turn out like that. As I say, the trip, they only thought it would last a year, and this is what he would do during that time. Thompson thought Mal would acquire sculptures of indigenous deities connected with the healing arts, pictures representing medical subjects, native surgical instruments, and other implements, along with documents of medical, surgical, and botanical interest. He was also commissioned to photograph anything of interest that could not be brought back to London, including buildings, traditional medical practitioners at work, and manuscripts which time would not allow to be copied or translated in situ. He was required to organise a transcription of rare manuscripts preserved in princely and other public libraries, and to employ pundits to carry out this task. And this copying is really, really important. As a result, the Wellcome Library now holds copies of very rare manuscripts, of which the originals, in many instances, have deteriorated in India and really can't be used for research, and the texts are illegible. So those copies that Pal got made are very, very important for the history of this region. So just like Thompson, Mal's sending back to London monthly lists of what he's buying, but these letters really captured almost the danger of of his activities in India. In sort of April 1911, he writes from Rawalpindi about the outbreak of plague that's harming his journey, and he's risking his life to be a collector for Henry Wellcome. And let's look at this letter here. This is 6th of July 1911. And you get the sense in the letter here, this section here. Since writing last, I've done 6 stages in 6 days. I crossed the pass yesterday at 1,300 feet, although ice and snow, part of the road being very difficult and treacherous. It's bitterly cold here at night. This place is over 11,000 feet above sea level. The journey, as you imagine, is very tedious. It will take 23 days to get to Kulu, One cannot do more than 18 miles a day. Some of the roads and paths are very dangerous. There are rope suspension bridges to cross when you have nothing under your feet. They're hanging up in the air, only 2 ropes supporting you under your arms. As somebody who works in a library nowadays, I'm quite glad that I'm not going on expeditions like this to collect for the Wellcome Library now. So we can see from Mal's journeys and Mal's letters the difficulties of what he's trying to do. And he's very successful with it, trying very hard to get into monasteries and get into palaces. And you can actually track his progress through India during this time. And by the end of 1911, Pal actually draws a map for Thompson and sort of convinces Thompson through this map that actually 1 year is just not enough to collect all the material that he wants to do. So this map here, we've sort of got where Tibet is up here. Summer would be spent in Nepal in 1912, and winter 1911-1912 in this half of India as well. So sending this back to Thompson, Wellcome and Thompson agree Mal should stay for a bit longer. As I say, he stays to 1921. And things don't go according to plan with the postal service sending things back to London. Thompson writes to Mal on 1st September 1913. Unfortunately, 5 or 6 of the cases containing what I take to be the fixtures and stock of the native druggists or medicine men had their contents entirely smashed to atoms on arrival. So the thing that there's material lost to the Wellcome enterprise through these travels as well. So you could collect all this material, but even sending it back to London is difficult. It's no surprise that after that Mal starts sending things across India to Burroughs Wellcome and Co.'s offices in Bombay, where things are kept safely there. So some really interesting local detail that comes through in this correspondence about sort of Mal's life in India at that time and about the sorts of material he deemed to be historical medical implements that would be of interest to Wellcome. And you get the sense as well of how times are changing in India as well. During this period, there's the beginnings of the growth of Indian nationalism in the country at that time. And Mal does his best, just as Thompson was doing, to sort of key into different networks and communities to collect. So you have in Mal's correspondence this, Mal's membership form for the Theosophical Society. So a global movement built around inner harmony and world peace that was involved by this time in India in the proto-nationalism movement. Mal deems it important for him to be a part of that, to find out more people in India who might have more interesting collections for him to try and get his hands on. But there's also the mundane aspect of life as well. Well, I say mundane. Also in the correspondence is this license, which suggests the difficulties of travelling through India and how Mal felt. As the last line suggests, this is an official license to have a shotgun. Excuse me. So he's not just travelling alone. He has something for company with a rifle with him. So I say Mal returned to London in 1921 and spent the next 5 years or so cataloguing all the items that he has collected during that time. And again, you know, as Thompson sort of left the Wellcome under a bad light, the same thing happened to Mal as well. He leaves Wellcome's employment in 1926 after a minor dispute over an object he's purchased at auction. Wellcome says, you shouldn't be buying things for yourself during my working time. So Mal had asked for a pay rise for years and years and years and hadn't been granted one. So in 1926, he leaves Wellcome's employment as well. So another collector and cataloguer leaves the museum. And really the last collector I want to speak about today is this gentleman here. This is an image of Captain Peter Johnston Saint, who is this wonderful, debonair-looking individual sort of redolent of sort of interwar sort of spy stories almost. Very sort of intriguing character. He collects for Wellcome, but his life pre-Wellcome employment is very interesting. He serves with the Indian Army in the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War, and he joins the staff in 1920 after writing some publishes during this time as well, sort of accounts of his travels through France. So some sort of quite interesting minor interwar travel literature comes from this gentleman as well. So he joins the staff in 1920, and by 1926 he's risen up the ranks. He's helped organise a large exhibition on Joseph Lister in the Historical Medical Museum. And after Thompson has left and Mal has left, Johnson Saint sort of rises up through the ranks and becomes the museum's foreign secretary, devoted to travel abroad and to collecting from a wider region than Mal and Thompson actually had. So Johnson Saint has buying trips in Europe, through North Africa, the Balkans and Near East, and he goes to India as well. We've seen what sort of Mal was getting up to there. Thompson manages to acquire, when he's in India, the doors of the medical school in Lhasa. And then in Ceylon, he gathers together, some really beautiful manuscripts, one of which I'll show you in a moment. But he also takes pictures when he's out there. He's seen to be by his friends as quite a sort of charming interwar character. It's a very nice sort of illustration of Johnson Saint and his travels here. He goes to, as he's in Egypt, he's at archaeological sites in Jericho and Lachish in Palestine. In 1930, he takes this photograph of Asclepius' bas relief in the courtyard of the museum at Damascus. So, he's a very, very well-travelled man, and he seems to have more support than Mal and Thompson had as well. He seems to be allowed to spend more money to acquire on Wellcome's behalf. And it's interesting about how important photography is this too as well. To Wellcome, it's not only just, you shouldn't just have an original of something. You can't get the original, a copy will do just as fine. It's a lot of photographs into the collection of material with that reason as well. So as I say, when he was in India, he collected not only the doors of a medical school in Lhasa, he also gathered together a large part of the Sinhalese palm leaf manuscripts that we have in the library now. So we have quite a few of these materials here. This one, excuse me, this one shows parts of the life of the Buddha. Very ornate, very, very fragile material. Oh, gosh, be careful. And it's just interesting to conceive of this. This was still about healing and about notions of ill health in that part of the world. So again, Wellcome's collections are not just Western, in inverted commas. They're very much more broader than that. And Johnson Saint seems very, very comfortable in any sort of social setting. He has audiences with the Pope and with the Viceroy of India. And his travels in Spain are aided that he meets the Queen of Spain when he's there. And he actually knew her when she was Princess Ina. She was Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, one of Johnson Saint's school friends. So he's very, very well-traveled, very, very well-read. And himself and Wellcome are very much involved in collecting material from France. And France appears to be so happy that they're raising the profile of France's medical history by collecting vast chunks of it, that Johnson Saint and Wellcome get the Légion d'honneur from the French government for their activities in collecting in that country. But just like Mal, just like Thompson, Johnson Saint's career ends rather sadly as well. In 1934, Thompson becomes the head of the Historical Medical Museum, which by this point has moved from Wigmore Street to a new building on the Euston Road. That's the building where Wellcome Collection still is now. However, the museum never properly opens on the Euston Road site. Wellcome dies in 1936. And after the years of the war, Wellcome's trustees came to the conclusion that his collection should be rationalised, meaning many parts began to be dispersed. And the man who first starts to oversee this dispersal is Johnson Saint. So you have this man who spent a large part of his life collecting for Wellcome, now becoming the man in charge of dissipating the collection, dispersing it. That must have been very difficult for him to accept, and he leaves in about 1948 from the employment of the Wellcome. Now, there are a few, well, there's quite a lot of other collectors who worked for Wellcome as in foreign climes. I'll leave their details aside for the moment. I'll just include details of one individual to add to the three gentlemen we've spoken about already. And that's a lady called Catherine Georgievski. Now, Georgievski's travels to Czechoslovakia in the 1930s to collect for the Wellcome there. And initially, she's looking for material in Prague relating to John Dee, the alchemist, when he moved to Prague in the turn of the 17th century. And she doesn't find any material on John Dee there. She acquired a number of paintings, though, including this very interesting work, early 18th century work in Czechoslovakia. And it gives you a sense of the oddities of some of the paintings we have in the library's collection. This is an image, this painting shows three individuals, and they're personifications of medicine, so book-based learning. This is a personification of apothecaries, so there's lots of pots and pans on his person. And this is the surgeon on the right-hand side with tools and implements and cutting devices there. So she collects a number of interesting paintings in Czechoslovakia, but she also visits a spa. She visits a number of healing spas. And one in particular is worthy of note, because I think it's almost testament to the variety of what Wellcome was collecting and what his collectors were collecting. In a spa called Franzensbad in Bohemia, Georgievski sends back samples of the mud from the medicinal baths. So we're not just talking books, manuscripts, paintings, objects, we're talking mud. That can be part of the story of the history of medicine. I've even found the file that is from the Materia Medica department of the museum, cataloguing the mud. So almost anything could fit within the remit and the world of the Historical Medical Museum and Wellcome's thinking on the history of medicine. And we'll sort of finish by sort of thinking about the lesser-known lights in the collecting world. We have some sort of high-level collectors we've been discussing earlier on. But Wellcome would send along to the auctions often storemen from his stores as people who would be almost anonymous, who the dealers wouldn't suspect. Wellcome always thought if you dressed up for an auction, they'd see you coming and you'd expect to pay more money for something. If he sent along his sort of workman and mufti, he'd get away with lower prices. And so, you know, the storemen become part of the story about collecting for Wellcome's behalf. But one of the storemen, we'll finish with his thoughts on Wellcome towards the end of Wellcome's life. There's a man called William Britchford. And Britchford enters Wellcome employment in 1926, and later in Britchford's life, he recounts his encounters with the elderly Wellcome and there is the Medical Museum in Euston Road, the never completed Medical Museum there. So this is Wellcome's home in his later years. Excuse me. And Britchford recounts his encounters with the elderly Wellcome here. He remembers that in Wellcome's later years, when he was well and was at his home in Gloucester Gate, Stevenses, the auctioneers, would give Wellcome the key to their warehouse, and he would spend Sunday all alone there, looking at the things they would auction during the week. Note, Wellcome's not spending time in his own very packed stores with his own collections, but the storage areas of an auctioneer's. Even at the end of Wellcome's life, he was still wanting to accumulate. A quote from a sort of a French sociologist sums this up. Quote, "The most important part of the collection is the missing one." So the collection, I hope, I've shown today is not just something solely put together by Wellcome. His collectors, share some of his personality traits, yet differ in other ways. They have a mix of secrecy and socializing, of knowing the right people. Yet there's an incompleteness to the story. Both Thompson and Mal have, leave their employment under a cloud. Johnson Saint leaves disappointed. He's starting to break up the collection he'd helped put together. And Wellcome himself, as I've just said, even at the end of his life, he wants more material. He's not happy with what he's collected already. But I want to finish on a positive note, and that's with these papers as well. Just the other day, with all this material that we have in the library, more collectors keep coming to light. I came across somebody, but yesterday, a gentleman called Mervyn Palmer, a traveller and archaeologist in South America whose correspondence with Wellcome was full of tales of discoveries of new animals and of coming across things like a two-headed snake. But, you know, I think that's a story for another day. But just to sort of finish with this thought is, you know, this archive was designed and is constructed as the administrative record of the work of Wellcome's collectors and of Wellcome himself, but has, to me, become as diverse and as interesting as those objects that were collected themselves. And I think I'll finish there. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Ross, for such a fascinating talk. As someone who's stood in the collections of Wellcome at the Science Museum store and looked around me at a room full of chamber pots, you sort of begin to wonder about what was driving Wellcome, and obviously similar sort of drives were behind these collectors as well, so it's wonderful to hear about them. We have some time for questions, so I will take them now.
Do you also have documentation of the disbursement of the collections, where things went?
We do. We've got, and that's one of the most used parts of the collection is for that. We get lots of correspondence from museums that have material now and want to know more about the origins of how it came into their collection. I've recently been doing some work with the Horniman Museum, chasing mermaids. They have a mermaid in their collection that was once in the Wellcomes, and we've been tracking down other mermaids elsewhere, as well as one that's still in the Wellcomes ownership in the Science Museum as well. But yeah, we've got the material on the dispersal. It takes some digging to find things at times. One of the problems with the Wellcome archive is that the cataloguing system changed over time. There was almost, you know, as I've almost suggested today, there was so much material coming into London from across the world. Wellcome staff couldn't keep up with it, and they changed their accession records over time. But yeah, we do know where things went to a large degree. Thanks.
My name's Ray Ward. I don't know if anyone remembers me, but I worked in the Wellcome Library for nearly 2 years in 86, 87, on retrospectively cataloguing the what was called the historical collection, books and other things published after 1851. And I knew John Simons, and he was kind enough to send me a copy of this history of the Wellcome Library, which you no doubt know. The most striking thing about the library, and indeed the collection itself, was what a magpie Wellcome was, and the amount of stuff that he collected. Some of it was truly remarkable. I catalogued a copy of the Book of Common Prayer presented to a soldier in the Crimean War by Florence Nightingale and signed by her, and the amount of material in the archives, in the library, in the collection itself was a big problem, and as you say, a great deal of it was frankly rubbish. And what was done about that, and was anyone ruthless enough to enough simply to say, oh, we don't need this, it's not relevant, let's dump it? There was a great deal of stuff in the library, for instance, that wasn't strictly relevant to the history of medicine. You know, the instructions to the Viceroy to his successor for the Viceroy of Mexico and so on, which I'm sure was great interest to people who are interested in the history of Mexico, but no great relevance to the history of medicine.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fair point. I mean, the collections are very, very broad, and the library still a history of medicine library, but the breadth of where the collections go, even from that starting point, are so diverse. I mean, my current favourite bay end, this is how to begin a sentence. My current favourite bay end has alcoholic beverages, atomic disasters. You know, and so that gives you a sense of where things can go in the Wellcome Library. But you're right. I mean, I think particularly after Wellcome's death, there's a huge problem then, because the Wellcome business wasn't doing so well then, and it's the trustees have to work out what to do with all these objects and pay the death duties on them. And because there was very little money from the business to pay the death duties on it, you know, that starts the process of thinking about and rationalising what can be done. But it takes, arguably, you know, it takes almost 50 years for the material to be dispersed totally, and for the last, the objects we put into the Science Museum in the late 70s, early 80s. So, I mean, we are still cataloguing material that Henry Wellcome collected in the Wellcome Library. That's the scale of what we're doing. But, I mean, it's really this key to sort of point out, he never saw the vast majority of things he collected. The stuff was still in packing cases when he died. You know, if you have in your head the last few minutes of Citizen Kane and like the camera panning across, you know, that's what we're talking about. And if you want sort of the Rosebud sled, sorry if I'm giving away if you haven't seen it, well, but we're talking about that small Neolithic implement. So that's sort of for him, that's where things started off from. That was his inspiration. But it's but yeah, we still have this. That's one of the problems we have with the Wellcome Library at times. We know it's history of medicine, but we still have people coming in to use our collections from lots of different disciplines, which is great.
Is there any estimated value of this collection?
When we value materials in the library, it's usually when they're going on exhibition. So there is some extremely expensive material. If a first edition Vesalius came on to the market, you're talking sort of millions when all said and done. And I think it's interesting to think about worth and value in Wellcome's terms. I mean, he was so adamant at times to pay the lowest possible price for something. So he really, you know, he will wait years in conversations with other collectors to try and drive the price down. And there's examples of Wellcome almost waiting. You get the sense he's almost waiting for somebody to die, and then acquire the material afterwards. And there's situations where that occurs. So it's like any collection, the worth and value of it changes over time. And almost the academic, the research value of it changes over time as well. I mean, what's fascinating about the library's collections is that materials that might not be looked at for a specific period of time, due to changes in academic practice and disciplinarity, suddenly become the most used items in our collections. The thing I've got in my head when I say that is these 17th century domestic remedy manuscripts. So things like a book of recipes written by Robert Boyle's sister. So, you know, it's very, very interesting material to think about gender during that period as well. But yeah, the worth and value alters over time, but there's some very, very expensive material still owned by the Wellcome.
Yeah. Ross, it seemed like over the last few years that the Wellcome Trust has become part of London's kind of culture as well. I mean, it feels like certainly in the last sort of 10 years with the events and the shows, which seem to be getting bigger and each time. And but they're not actually shows which are directly involving the collection, are they? They're actually, I mean, the Death Show, which is coming up, they're medically related. Could you just talk about that, the relationship between the, you know, this incredible collection, which most of us don't get to see,
yep,
and the way that shows that, you know, you're choosing to do the exhibitions that you're doing at the moment.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think there's always, speaking to somebody who doesn't have that much involvement in the curation of the shows, there's always a balance trying to be done by the curators in trying to have some material from the collections at times, but also interspersed with modern artistic comments upon older material as well. So there's always attempts to have a sort of balance between the old and the new in most of the Wellcome Collection temporary exhibitions. I think the one thing to sort of point out, maybe to underline, is an awful lot of Wellcome Library material goes into a lot of the shows, but you might not always notice it's from the library. But there's, I think with the changes that will happen to the building in the next few years, with the massive redevelopment that will be undertaking, the notion is to have more display areas for more material to be on display. And the library is also undergoing a huge process of digitization. So we're trying to get as much material from our collections freely available online through that as well. But as I think with the shows that have been put on, And people who have curated them, possibly who might be in this room, might disagree with me, but I think there's always a balance between what you want to do in those shows, and always have some rarer materials on show in there. But you're right, the upcoming show has is from a different collector's collection, but we do have a lot of material on death, cheerily, in the Wellcome Library, lots of Vanitas paintings and Memento Mori paintings that contrast with those works as well, though. But I hope that sort of is, yeah,
In looking at the correspondence between Wellcome and his collectors, at what level of detail were their instructions? What do the shopping lists look like?
It depends, is the honest answer. Sometimes it's very direct, sort of like he will mark up auction catalogues with, this is what I'm after from that particular auction. So on that level, it's very, very precise what he's looking from an auction at Christie's on whatever date you want to pick. But with sort of Mall, with Thompson, with Johnson Saint, they are sort of given a bit of leeway at times as well. And a lot of it is left to them to start building up connections. So it comes and goes of how precise it is. But if Wellcome sees something he's after, he'll set the dogs loose and go after it sort of wholesale. I mean, that's the trickiness with it at times. You feel sometimes with Wellcome that he had a giant jigsaw lid, and he had all these objects, and he knew how all the jigsaw pieces put together because he had the lid to go from. He put all these pieces together. That would be the story of medicine, story of mankind, through the evolution of objects, through the evolution of mankind as well. Unfortunately, every so often you get the sense that he loses the lid of the jigsaw. And maybe he changes a little of the jigsaw as well to what he actually wants to do with the collection. So, and then what we're doing nowadays, you really sort of feel that different people are using the collections in different ways and then have different purposes to it than he had in his conception at his time. So I hope that, I mean, it's tricky to sort of give you specific examples, but certainly with actual auctions, he's going at it wholesale with what he's after. He's got his shopping list then.